On this episode of China Unscripted, what the CCP is trying to hide about its ties to Hamas, and should China be labeled a state sponsor of terror? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
And joining us once again is GUERMANTES G-MAN LAILARI. He's a retired U.S. Air Force Foreign Area Officer specializing in the Middle East and Europe, as well as a strategy, irregular warfare, and missile defense expert. He's also a member of the Jewish Policy Center Board of Fellows and a visiting researcher at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
All right. Well, you know, I can't believe I'm saying this because like this doesn't usually happen, but so there's like war in the Middle East. I don't know if you've
I heard about that.
Yeah, and so you have an interesting article out that where you believe that China is tied to Hamas in a variety of ways. It might be nice to kind of hear some of that for people who haven't read the article. But why do you think the CCP wants to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, of Israel and Hamas, which is not a country?
Well, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has been active all around the world since its beginning in revolutionary movements. I mean, that's why you have the term Maoist whatever. You know, you have Maoist terrorist groups in India. You have Maoist groups all over the world. In South Africa, they helped SWAPO and all these different organizations overthrow the governments. So yeah, they're into that. That's their thing.
You never see Maoist dumplings or dim sum. Maoist dim sum.
It would just be red cooking pork. That's the whole thing. That's all.
That's great.
But you know, that was Mao. Now it's the good CCP, right? Like they don't fund.
They don't believe in that like global international communism, right?
I think you drank the wrong Kool-Aid, Chris.
Oh, I was feeling happy for a change, so obviously it was something different. So they are still doing this then.
Yeah, it continues throughout everywhere. I mean, you look at Myanmar, you look at, like I said, I mentioned India, you look at Nepal, you look at all the regions that they're doing it. You know, you had a whole thing on the Solomon Islands. I mean, they're continuing to do it everywhere. So you shouldn't be surprised, or the audience shouldn't be surprised also, that they're doing it in the Middle East as well.
I guess when you think about things like the Solomon Islands, like that's like it's obvious that the CCP is doing these influence campaigns on the governments of different countries around the world.
But it's like giving money to bribing people, not like funding or giving arms to Hamas kind of stuff, which is definitely what Mao did back in the day.
Well, not to Hamas,
but
Hamas.
To
other groups. Yeah.
But the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, they were
in the 1960s. Yasser Arafat, when he was head of the PLO, he made many visits to China. In fact, he also visited Vietnam during the Vietnam War to learn lessons from the Viet Cong on how to, try to get rid of the Israelis. And Ho Chi Minh told him, "You have one problem." He said, in Vietnam, the French could go back to France. The U.S. could go back to the U.S. In the case of Israel, Ho Chi Minh supposedly said to Yasser Arafat, the Jews don't have any place to go. So you're not going to win that war. Not what he wanted to hear. But to zoom forward to today, I think I'd like to explain to you the big overall picture and then go into the details, if that's okay with you.
Please.
So I don't know if in your program previously you discussed the three wars strategy. We're not talking about the three warfares, like media warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. We're talking about last year there was a think tank called Kunlun Si, and there's a researcher there called Long K Fong. And he discussed what he called Beijing's three wars strategy. And the idea behind that is is basically to defeat the U.S. and its allies by exhausting us around the world, much like the PLA and Mao did against the KMT, the Kuomintang, during the Civil War. So their plan is to exhaust us. And so the three wars that they're talking about, the first one, of course, is Ukraine. And in that war, we're throwing ourselves, and the Europeans are throwing themselves, and some other countries, even Japan, is throwing themselves to support Ukraine against Russia. The second area is what we just talked about, is the Middle East. To force the Americans and its allies, i.e., Israel, and recently, when Iran attacked Israel, they also got the Saudis and the Jordanians and the French and the British involved in working with Israel to protect it from the attack from Iran. And of course, also in the Middle East, we have the Red Sea problem with the Houthis, or they're also really called Ansar Allah, which is their Arabic name, attacking shipping in the Red Sea, going to Europe or coming from Europe and the Mediterranean. And so the question is which is the third one? And some people say it could be the North and South Korea, or someplace in Asia where the third area would be. And then once the U.S. and its allies and the friends of Taiwan are at their lowest levels of weapons and personnel available to fight China, then China would take advantage of that. Or not necessarily immediately, but maybe, in a certain amount of time, because then it takes a lot of time to build up your armaments after you've depleted them in all these different wars around the world.
And then I assume the idea is when the U.S. is exhausted, that's when Taiwan can be taken.
Yes, or soon thereafter, give or take, let's say 6 months or possibly a year. So, it is a theory that is being bantered around. It was published last year, this article, and it's been discussed several times. Even in Taiwan, it's been discussed on the local media, and so it is a strategy. Now, whether or not it will work is another question. For example, in Ukraine, there are very little anti-ship missiles being fired against Russian ships or Ukrainian ships. It's not a sea war. In the Red Sea, again, the anti-ship missiles are not being used. It's more about missile defense in the Red Sea, and also with Israel, it's more about missile defense. So the missile defense systems are being depleted. The army systems, the U.S. HIMARS or tanks, armored personnel carriers, all these sort of army typical weapon systems are being depleted in Ukraine. And so the theory doesn't work if they don't figure out a way to get rid of the extra, let's say, anti-ship missiles, for example.
So they need another war that depletes the Navy and the Marines.
Right. But again, it's a theory that they're talking about. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. So that it's a strategy. So hopefully the allies are smart enough not to fall for something that would put them at risk for supporting Taiwan in the future.
So, obviously it makes sense that the CCP would be happy that the West is bogged down in Ukraine and in Israel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that China is behind it, right? They could just be happy about these totally external circumstances.
Right. It only shows possible motivation. Okay, it's not you don't see a direct as necessarily a direct logical connection between that. But in my article, which I'm going to discuss now, I do bring in some more overall motivations for China to encourage attacks against Israel, and there are three main reasons, and I can go into that if you'd like.
Please.
One of the problems of the world people is that we forget things, and so you might have remembered, or you might not have remembered, that in September this last year, weeks before the attack on 7 October, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and Israel were going to announce a historic agreement, basically another version of the Abraham Accords. And in fact, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, announced on 22 September that Israel was close to a dramatic breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, supported by the U.S. So that's 2 weeks before the attack. So now we're getting a little closer to motivation. So why is this important? Last year, in the March of 2023, if you remember, Beijing arranged an entente, basically a ceasefire between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And, basically, she got the two guys to kiss and make up, so to speak. And also, Saudi Arabia was being drawn closer and closer to China. China was able to get some sweet oil deals also during this time frame. So Saudi Arabia, from the Western point of view, was kind of getting cozy with China. And as you know, in the past, the U.S. has protected Saudi Arabia, for example, in the first Gulf War. So this peace treaty that President Biden and Saudi Arabia and Israel were going to sign included also supposedly a mutual defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and the United States. In other words, the United States was going to guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia as part of the peace treaty between Israel and, not peace treaty, but an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Also, the United States was going to provide commercial nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia so they could, for example, the United States would assist Saudi Arabia with uranium reprocessing. And there were some concessions to the Palestinians, again, according to news reports. But basically, this agreement would have pulled back Saudi Arabia away from China and directly under the umbrella of the United States, which is clearly not in the interest of China. So that is a motivation to stop this event and encourage. My argument is encourage Hamas to do something that would disrupt this major announcement that President Biden was going to sign between Saudi Arabia. It'd be like a picture of Carter and King Hussein of Jordan and Shimon Peres, in the 1990s. So this was going to be a big deal,
And it was successfully disrupted. I mean, this isn't happening now, right?
No, yeah, it's well, the way the terminology is being used, it's delayed, but it's pretty much delayed until Israel's war with Hamas is over, and then it might be reopened. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. But yeah, it's currently off the not on the program, so to speak, until things calm down in between Hamas and Israel. The second motivation is that, again, in September, but this was being planned before. All these things are being planned before, but the announcements were happening in September, a month before the attack. On 10 September, President Biden and the leaders of India, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates European Union, um, and Israel announced the launch of the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor called IMEC, IMEC. During the G20 meeting in India earlier last year, that would create a new trade route connecting India to the Middle East and Europe. And basically, these goods would be traveling between Europe and India through Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and Israel. So this agreement would bypass the BRI that Xi Jinping had set up in the Middle East. It wouldn't be part of his program.
Is the Belt and Road active in the Middle East currently?
Is the BRI active? Yes, yeah, for sure. You've got stuff going from Iran to China. You've got stuff, oil, for example, is flowing heavily, so to speak, from the Middle East to China, and all the commercial items that China produces is using the BRI network that goes through Pakistan and then it comes out into the Indian Ocean and then goes to the Middle East, for example. So yeah, it's very active. But this plan would bypass all those projects that the CCP had laid out, and so again, the IMEC plan is also on hold because of this attack on 7 October. And the third motivation is, again, about 2 years ago, China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, which came into effect in 2022. And this agreement was worth $400 billion in terms of basically China would be buying $400 billion of oil and gas in exchange for a whole variety of things, including defense, weapons, training, exercises, intelligence sharing. So this was a big win for Iran and China. And don't forget, this was when Iran had difficulty selling its oil and gas because of the sanctions that were on it, and that were later lifted by the Biden administration. So this agreement, 25 years, China and Iran are best buddies now. So if you think about it, with Saudi Arabia being pulled away from this entente with Iran, and the Iranians stirring up a lot of trouble in the Middle East, I believe that again China would benefit from this because Iran's position would become stronger in the Middle East because of a weakened Israel and a sort of a demonstration of how much power Iran's reach could influence the Middle East. So more countries, let's say, that are aligned with the U.S., let's say Jordan or the UAE, even Saudi Arabia, would be concerned about Iran using its proxies to attack these countries. By these three motivations, I believe, are big factors in causing the attack. And then I can explain to you the actual data that I was able to find in my research about Hamas's actions prior to the attack, during the attack, and after the attack, that again point to a hand of China in this whole process.
I guess, before we get to that, I understand what you're saying, that China, the CCP, would have concerns about the IMEC corridor, about Saudi Arabia getting closer, having a mutual defense treaty with the U.S. But it also seems like Iran would more directly be concerned by these things, right? So, I guess I mean, like,
I'm not denying that Iran was involved, but what a lot of reporters have focused on is the Hamas-Iran connection. But in my article, I go into the details of what was found, what evidence, actual evidence. These three motivations are the sort of the outline, and the guts of the argument are in the rest of the article.
Yeah, because China is very close to Iran. Iran depends on China in many ways. So, if China has some interest in the Middle East,
well, I
I
mean,
could
I
see
guess
them being able to pull some string.
I'm just saying that it seems like Iran would more directly be concerned about all of those things that you mentioned.
Yeah, but
so they
also
may not even need the
It's win-win
CCP.
mutual cooperation. It's what Xi Jinping loves to talk about. Iran wins, China wins, everyone else loses.
Yeah, but I think, also like you're here to talk about China, right? This is not Iran
No. I'm just saying
unradicalized.
that, like, I
Right.
see how
Iran could have independent motivations completely outside of China.
Yeah.
yes, for
But
using the same argument, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah. But
Okay. All right. So let me use that the third motivation a little stronger to make the point is, since there's a close connection between, as you mentioned, between Iran and China, right? If you're an ally or if you have a close relationship between countries, you're not going to start a war or encourage a war without consultation. So at a minimum, China, if you try to minimize China's influence on this, you could say that Iran informed China about the future event.
let me just quickly interject there as like a proof of point. It came out that Xi Jinping asked Russia to delay its invasion of Ukraine till after the Winter Olympics were over. So China does have an impact on these other countries and their strategic planning. So the idea that there was some kind of conversation going on between China and Iran is not insane.
Right. And I document actually some meetings that happened before the war where Hamas or the PLO or the Palestinian Authority, which has a representation of Hamas in it, was meeting with China, with Russia, and if you let me go on, maybe I can convince you more, Shelley.
Yeah,
How's
sure.
that?
No, I
Okay.
like to see Shelley just kind of grasping in the dark here.
What do you mean?
I'm preventing him from going on.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, my point was just that, like, it's not that I disbelieve your argument. I'm just saying, essentially,
That Shelley is always skeptical, as she should be.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And let me come to the actual facts that are on the ground and or events that happened prior to. And I think you'll come closer. And I think most people, when they read my article, were, Shelley, is probably a perfect example of a cynical or a questionable argument. So let's say first, let's go through the first fact is, when the IDF went into Gaza to take out Hamas, lo and behold, they found large caches of Chinese weapons in the tunnels. I mean, Chinese weapons, not Chinese-like or based on the technology of China, but actual Chinese weapons in the tunnels. They also found intelligence gathering equipment that was made in China and other military supplies, but specifically on the military equipment. They found large numbers of assault rifles, the QBZ assault rifle, and the grenade launcher QLZ-87. It's an automatic grenade launcher. They even found scopes, telescopic scopes that could be put on M16s, the US M16s that Hamas had acquired either through stealing from the IDF or through other means. But the sights were actually, again, made in China. Very high-end communications equipment, SIGINT collection systems, again, made in China, tactical military radios, explosives. One of the things that they found was these very, very sophisticated explosives made in China. So, the tunnels were used for a lot of different things, and one set of tunnels between Egypt and Gaza was for smuggling people, commercial items, and weapons. And so this is how it got into Gaza. Now, the Egyptians might or might not have known about this, but there was a lot of smuggling going on. And, people make money off it, whether you're part of the smuggling team or you're getting bribed. But that's a fact. The IDF found all this equipment made in China.
I mean, couldn't it be that China gave weapons to Iran, Iran gave it to Hamas, or as you say, smugglers just somehow got a hold of Chinese weapons, that it might not necessarily be that China intended.
Directly sold to
Yeah.
Hamas is what you mean.
Right, absolutely. But I'm getting there. We're getting closer and closer.
Will you let him speak, Shelley?
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
It's your show. So anyway, the argument that it is not just from Iran is because it's such a large quantity. When countries sell weapons to other countries, they also want to make sure that their weapons don't get into other people's hands that they don't necessarily want them to get. So let's assume that, like you said, that they're from Iran via, they're from China but via Iran. But if China was aware of these weapons being shipped to Hamas, at any point they could have told Iran, stop it. Okay, that's an argument that I think is pretty interesting. And oddly enough, when Israel in December and finally came out with more precise list of weapons that they found that were Chinese made, in January, the Communist Party, had a big, they had a press conference. They said, any weapons that were Chinese were not from us, and we don't know how they got there. So the old joke is when people, how you tell when a communist is lying? When they're talking. So anyway, yes, that's one argument. Another argument is that they did find missile technology that was from China. It is used by Iran and the Houthis and Iraqi militia groups. So all these groups that are firing missiles at Israel, firing missiles at shipping in the Red Sea, the technology came from China. Okay. Now, the next thing is the training aspect. Let me go first to really hit the nail on the target here to answer Shelley's point. There's a man named Mohammed Def, and he is the head of the military wing of Hamas. Now, what's interesting about Mohammed Def is that, again, according to my research, it's available online. He has 2 Chinese wives, and he also has a Palestinian. Right. Now, this wasn't a gift from China. They didn't send the women over to Gaza, as a, like in the old Qing dynasty where you give away women kind of thing. No, he actually married them in China. And what was he doing in China? In the 1990s, the PLA, he went to a PLA school, the artillery school, and ordnance school, where he learned about rockets, missiles, and explosives.
And women.
So, and he learned about Chinese women, right? So
if you really learned about women, you would not have 2 wives.
That's very true.
Well, at one point he had 4, but one of them was killed in a previous war with Israel. But anyway, in the 1990s, for several years he was trained in China.
What was his affiliation at the time in the 90s?
In the 90s, he was he was sent there by the PLO, and then he became a member of Hamas later on.
Okay, because I mean, like, remember how in the 1980s, supposedly the CIA trained Osama bin Laden, who was part of the Mujahideen at the time, right?
Yep.
Not knowing that later Al Qaeda would come to fruition, right? So, like, is this really different from that? Is it the same?
Okay, good point. So there is some evidence that one of his wives is in communication with the CCP even today. So it's not like he got trained and then he was cut loose and then he became Osama bin Laden. He apparently one of his wives, Chinese wives, has a direct line, according to the reports I read, to the CCP leadership.
That really does not seem like much of a stretch. Like that's their MO, really.
What is their MO?
Oh, having these well-placed spouses.
Are you talking about somebody in particular?
No one. So definitely no one in the U.S.
Okay, sure.
Well, actually, you had that case in California, right, where you had a lovely lady from China who was being friendly with one of the congressmen, right?
Oh yeah, he wasn't.
Fang.
Yeah, I mean,
There's many people actually she was being friendly with.
But like, are you saying that one of Mohammed Deif's wives is, because Fang is like a CCP spy sent to the U.S. to try to like cultivate, future politicians and things like that. But are you saying?
Well, I'm saying that she has again, the report said that she has a direct line to the CCP leadership, and I'm not saying that she's doing it as a spy. I think it's probably direct. In other words, it's known that she's there, and if there's any advice or requests for arms or training, that she can pass it on, and the CCP can decide whether or not they want to pursue it or not. Another source also indicated that the political leader of Hamas in Gaza, Ismail Haniyeh, also studied in Renmin University in Beijing. So again, these each one of these in and of itself, it might not be enough to convince you, but I think in aggregate, and I think that there is a good argument that there is a connection between them. Now, another fact was that during the Gaza war, the IDF discovered 2 PLA engineers in the tunnels. The PRC apparently tried to get these PLA engineers, out of Gaza before the Israelis found them. And I think the Israelis found them and they escaped or something. And, there's a story that the PRC became very desperate and tried to get the Russians to put pressure, to talk to Hamas or to get them out of there. Again, why are there PLA engineers in tunnels in Gaza? What does that mean? All right, so that's some of the reported facts of what I found in terms of the connection. Now, before 7 October, there were some other events and some other meetings that also are curious. Last April in 2023, Mohammed Abbas, who's the PA president, and the Hamas Politburo chief, Ismail Haniyeh, who I just mentioned, flew to Riyadh last year in April. Now, if you're planning an attack on Israel, I think a year before 6 months, 9 months before your attack, you probably know you're going to attack, or at least you think there's a possibility that you could attack. So I thought it was curious that these two guys show up in Riyadh and meet with some of the Saudi leadership. And Hania had not been in Saudi Arabia for over 10 years. So this is not like, hey, every year we go to, we go on the Hajj to Mecca, and do the prayer thing. And then, oh yeah, we'll meet the Saudis. No, this is the first time that he had been there in 10 years. Later, a month later, a senior Iranian delegation visited China and met some of the senior leadership there, including Wang Yi. And they were given a good time. Again, Mahmoud Abbas met Xi Jinping last June, like 3 months before the attack, and they made a joint statement. Now, again, the Palestinian Authority is connected to Hamas through how their leadership is set up, because they want to have a joint front against Israel. So they are talking.
I'm just what you're saying just reminded me that China also met with leaders of the Taliban like a month before U.S. troops withdrew, and the Taliban swept through.
I thought that was that before?
It was before.
Okay.
I remember because I did a post about it on Instagram, and they removed it. And I was kind of like, well, maybe if people were paying attention to this and not getting censored on social media, maybe something could have been done.
Could you explain the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas a little bit more?
He was about to get into that before you interrupted him, Shelley.
Oh, yeah.
So the relationship is on and off again. The Hamas Hamas PLO relationship is on and off again. The PA represents lots of different groups in the Palestinian legislature. The legislature is composed of a lot of different groups, including groups that the United States recognizes as terrorist groups, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Democratic Front for Palestine. All these groups are under the umbrella of the Palestinian Authority. But the head of it, Mohammed Abbas, is, I guess, from the U.S. point of view, a good guy. But on and off again, Hamas has worked with the PLO and sometimes killed each other. So, for example, in 2005, when Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, in the hope that the people there would develop their own country, the beginnings of their own country, there were elections in 2006. And the results were that Hamas beat the PLO. And
then stopped holding elections.
Right. And killed them, the ones that couldn't escape. So there's some bad blood. And for that same reason, Mohammed Abbas had elections, I forget what year, I think it's almost maybe 15, 20 years ago, in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And when and that was the last time they had elections, because they fear that if they had elections, that they would be out of office.
So basically, right now, the PLO controls the West Bank, and Hamas controls Gaza.
Correct. Right, but when you say control, Hamas is let's say the administrator, the political and the military police aspect of Gaza, but there's like a bunch of other militant groups in Gaza operating under Hamas's review. So when people say that Hamas attacked Israel on 7 October, it was like 10 different terrorist groups were involved in that attack. A majority, of course, were Hamas. But there's a whole slew of other terrorist groups that were involved, but it's not usually discussed because then you start getting very complicated names and groups. But anyway, yes. So in the West Bank, the PLO, it has what they call Palestinian Authority, and they have different groups under them as well. And the PLO is the majority of power in that region. Now, obviously, they have problems with Hamas, and some of the PLO members support Hamas, and some of them don't. So there's this internal issue that I think it's better that we spend the time focusing on China than into
I mean,
dive
part of the
deeper.
reason I ask is because there was a news item that came out today as we're recording this episode that China may be hosting a meeting between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Beijing, like now.
Because
So
they're such great peacemakers.
yeah, so like this is my question: what do you think is up with that?
Well, if you agree with my hypothesis that China was involved directly with Hamas, this is a regrouping after the attack to plan out what the future will be in that region. And just out of just interesting parallelism, there's a whole group of KMT legislatures heading to Beijing as we speak. So you can imagine the interesting conversations that would be happening between the Taiwanese legislatures that are going to China before President-elect Lai gets inaugurated, in a month from now, on the 20th of May. So there's a lot of things going on.
It's a strange grouping of bedfellows.
Well, I mean, I think
Yeah.
what is interesting about the PA and Hamas meeting is it is being portrayed. I read this article in the South China Morning Post today, and essentially it was being portrayed like you said, Chris. It's because there's such great peacemakers. Like this is part of China trying to, extend their winning streak in the Middle East since they got Iran and Saudi Arabia to, talk to each other. Now they're getting Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to get together and, maybe they could mediate is how it's being portrayed.
Right. I mean, if you support both of these groups, then it makes sense that you can make peace because the one who holds the gold makes the rules, right? Isn't that how it works? So the interests of China in this whole picture goes back to, again, the idea that this could be part of their overall strategy of the three wars, and whether or not they want to see this conflict go on or not is a question. Now, obviously, Hamas is greatly diminished at this point, and if Hamas and the PLO make a temporary peace agreement because China tells them to, then maybe they can have a united front. Now, one of the things that have happened in the UN is that there were several votes in the UN about creating a Palestinian state, and the only country that prevented it was the United States. And so this could be an attempt by China to show a united front of Palestinian groups and to say that, we'll promise we won't attack Israel, and we're going to make peace and everything is good. Just don't don't vote against this UN security resolution to create a Palestinian state, and everything will be okay. And so a lot of pressure will be put on Israel to accept it, and many people in Israel will not accept it. But the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't matter what Israel thinks in the UN Security Council, because if the United States votes with or abstains with this vote of making a Palestinian state, in my opinion, the Middle East will become more unstable because now they'll be able to basically legitimize their attacks on Israel at a state level, and they'll have support of a lot of countries. The Palestinians already have embassies all around the world, as opposed to Taiwan, which is losing them. Anyway, so that's the another thing is interesting about the PRC is after the attack in October 7th, they were very non-supportive of Israel. They basically said, okay, you guys, stop fighting. Everything's, if you just stop fighting, everything's gonna be fine. And the Israelis were very upset by this attitude that almost like they ignored the fact that they had these terrorist groups had slaughtered civilians, 1,200 civilians, and done worse things than just slaughter them. And it wasn't only until I believe a month or two ago that China even showed up and sent an envoy to Israel to make it to start talking to the Israelis. I think a day or two after the attack, President Biden flew to Israel. He was there and really supported the Israelis and saying, we're with you. Do what you have to do. So it's very strange, and also the anti-Semitism that's going on in the social media in China, highly regulated system. The CCP has allowed a lot of anti-Semitism to grow and to proliferate all throughout China, and a lot of people who watch this kind of thing were noting that it's the first time that China has not done anything to stop it.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago I did an episode about anti-Semitism in China, and it's a big thing. YouTube demonetized that episode for anti-Semitism.
Reporting on anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism.
According to YouTube, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
So again, each one of these things by themselves don't make the verdict, but I think if in a court of public opinion, at least, I think it's something to consider and to think about. And now then there was the attack that Israel did against the IRGC generals in Damascus, and was able to kill the leader of the IRGC, who was responsible for conducting training and supplies to Hezbollah, a terrorist group. IRGC is also considered a terrorist group by the United States. So when people kill terrorists, it's a good thing. And Israel has been killing Iranian IRGC generals and other people for the last few years. So it's not like suddenly Israel kills these Iranians and the whole world goes upside down. Now, what was different, of course, was that they struck a building next to the embassy, which was a consulate. And so, there's an uproar about, diplomatic immunity and all this kind of stuff. But, when the Iranians had Hezbollah blow up our embassies in Beirut in the 1980s, they didn't really have a problem with that. So Iran has used its embassies to bring weapons and explosives and bad people in and out of a country to do bad things. So I don't think that's a big deal. But the response by Iran, ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles attack on Israel. Luckily, Israel and its allies were able to knock them out. And only, unfortunately, a little girl was injured. Arab-Israeli girl was injured. But what was interesting was that a lot of the missiles misfired, and they killed Iranians or injured Iranians before they even left the border of Iran. So that's the good news, because Iran's technology is obviously not the snuff, and they killed their own people, just like Hamas did in a lot of the rocket attacks against Israel. A lot of those rockets landed in Gaza. So I guess my conclusion is, I guess the most important thing is, I think we should look into China's support for terrorism around the world. I think we really should investigate this. And I think it's a serious issue.
You were mentioning these things that happened before October 7th, like the meetings that were happening. I didn't understand the significance of Mahmoud Abbas going to Saudi Arabia and Hamas going to Saudi Arabia.
Well, Mahmoud Abbas and the head of Hamas together went to. Basically, they ended up in Saudi Arabia together at the same time. It shows that there's a connection between.
I thought there was something about Saudi Arabia that was involved in this Iran China stuff.
Well, isn't that interesting? Because those two groups, the Hamas and PA, are kind of supposedly like opposing each other. They're tied to Iran, but then they go to Saudi Arabia. Like those again, it's very strange bedfellows getting together, right?
Right. That's what's strange. If they're already meeting in the same place at the same time with the same people, they can't hate each other that much. And the fact is that maybe they're already friends, and they're just having a temporary hate time, and China says, "Oh, you guys get together, everything's gonna be fine." They go, "Oh, thanks, yeah, it's great." So look, the PLO and Hamas both don't like the fact that Israel exists, and they would prefer it not to exist. They both have the same goal. It's just that their ideology is different, and maybe their strategy is different. But they both claim the same land, and they don't want Israel to exist. So they both have a common enemy from a point of view of their end goals. And so I'm suspicious about any claims that there is a major hostility going on between them. In fact, I'm sure the PLO is trying to manage the fact that if there were ever elections in the West Bank, they would have a major problem because they would lose. So anything they can do to survive and to stay in power, they're going to do. I think as time goes on, if we find more information about this connection between Hamas and China, or China and other groups, the Maoist groups are still active in India. They're causing mayhem in lots of different places. If there's proof that China is supporting the Islamic groups in the Philippines and all around Asia. These are things that I think are important because they have an interest in disrupting governments that are not kowtowing to them in the big picture of things. And then, it would be because Hamas is not a state. The victims of there's 40 countries that had their citizens killed by Hamas or taken hostage by Hamas. If you're a victim or you have family members that are a victim, how do you complain about this? Well, the normal way is you get your government to go to the UN, bring the country that was involved to explain what happened. And if they can't give a good explanation, then you have the right to go to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and pursue these people who were in charge of the country for crimes against the people who were injured. So if China is helping Hamas and the PA are not countries, then you only can go. I guess you can go to Iran, but that doesn't do much good because they don't really have much to lose in anything because they've been restricted in a lot of their commercial thing. But China would lose a lot of let's say social credit in the world. And I think just like what they're doing in East Turkestan against the Uyghurs, it's another human rights problem that they're doing.
So earlier you mentioned part of the strategy of the three wars is to exhaust the U.S. What I've been blown away with everything that's happened since October 7th is it's not just the U.S. military being exhausted; it's the U.S. society being exhausted. It has become such a divisive issue. We have seen. I mean, right now, Columbia University is basically occupied by pro-Palestinian protesters. I saw that the Free Press called it the communist Coachella.
I mean, it seems very socialist. Like,
yeah. Well, Shelley, you were telling me the other day about this article that talked about like these different outright communist groups funding some of this stuff.
Well, I mean, I think some of it was that there are pro-Palestine groups that may be providing some of the stuff like the tents that the people are using in Colombia and things like that. They're getting funding. They have a lot of supplies, food, etc. Could just be the students providing it, but there's certain, um, like the reporter witnessed, like, I forget, it was like a generator, some kind of equipment that had a label that said the People's Forum on it, which is, a group that's started by a Marxist billionaire who lives in New York and has some kind of ties with the CCP. He's not a Chinese guy, but like,
But he's a Marxist billionaire, which is a totally logical thing to be.
That's true. But so
He
there,
can afford to be a billionaire.
Yeah.
If he's a Marxist. But it sort of reminds me a little bit of what happened, when there were riots, the BLM type things that exploded across the United States. This thing. So it's or the Occupy Wall Street. It seems kind of strange that suddenly out of nowhere people suddenly get excited about something that normally maybe wouldn't,
well, a lot of it is because of TikTok. Like, I'm seeing so many people online saying, like, the reason the US government is going after TikTok is because it's the only free and uncensored platform, which is ridiculous. It's heavily censored, but that is getting the truth out about Israel.
right.
And so this Chinese-controlled PSYOP is pushing pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli propaganda on young people who then are going nuts and stabbing Jewish students in the eye.
And if 2 out of 3, young Americans is on TikTok, you can just imagine the level of influence that has.
I mean, I think there also was evidence that when it got kind of violent in Colombia a few days ago, that it was true that some of these pro-Palestine groups had like kind of infiltrated the protest. So it wasn't just the students
It was people from outside.
People from outside who are already part of these like leftist, pro-Palestine, like Marxist groups who came in to like kind of fan the flames.
I mean, this is how Marxist groups operate.
The word you're looking for is agent provocateur. If you want to use that as a title of this thing, that's great.
I think most people associate that with like fashion brands now because it's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, this is just another level of how this is all exhausting American society.
Yeah, I'm exhausted just reading about it.
Is your question about whether the CCP is involved in this, or?
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah. Like, do you have any insight about that?
Are they the agent provocateur?
I mean, outside of just TikTok.
Look, this is their overall strategy of destroying America is to atomize us, to make us not be cooperative, rather to break us apart, and anything that's already exists as a disagreement between people, they like to amplify it, and that's what TikTok does, is amplify the differences. I mean, a lot of social media does that, and that's how they make a lot of their money, is by creating these subgroups and subgroups, and people become very isolated, actually, from the greater population. And so I think if you look at their overall strategy in terms of how they operate, I mean, there's a scholar here. He was a former general in the ROC military, and his argument is that the amount of money we invest in weapons should be the same amount of money we invest in protecting ourselves against the psychological warfare that the CCP is using against not only Taiwan but any country, because we're not used to this kind of devious manipulation, and they're getting better and better at it. I mean, obviously, if they can make people who are normally, let's say, maybe supportive of Palestinians to become violent, that ability is going to be something that they're going to take note of, and they're going to use it in a future scenario where maybe it's not the Middle East, maybe it's some other topic, and they know how to manipulate people riot and cause chaos and mayhem in the United States and other countries.
I mean, even if it's not directly the CCP interfering, it's a lot of this Marxist ideology that is out there just around the world. I mean, it's always being framed from the perspective of, okay, Hamas, the Palestinians, they're oppressed. Israel is the oppressor. Therefore, they're freedom fighters, Hamas, and anything they do is justified.
I mean, if you watch some of these like pro Palestine students talk, it's, they're about like liberating. It's like liberation. Like a lot of this stuff that was like the popular kind of like causes or lingo that almost it reminds you of the 60s and and a lot of the stuff that was because of like these leftist like socialist groups and that kind of language.
Soviet front groups.
They don't really think about what happens after liberation. Like what,
Yeah. But then you also get like weird things like other marginalized and oppressed groups standing in solidarity with the oppressed Palestinians. And that's when you get things like Queers for Palestine. And it's like, do you know what you're saying? And
yeah, the Columbia, they had, I saw photos of some flag that said trans fags for Palestine. And it's that they would not do well under Hamas.
Yeah. There was like this tweet that a bunch of people were pushing out. I forget who said it. I actually can look it up real quick.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting too. I mean, Taiwan, it was one of the first Asian countries to allow gay marriage, and Israel is like the most liberal country in the Middle East that allows gay and trans and whatever your flavor is to live comfortably and not be harassed. Whereas if you go to specifically if you go to Gaza, you'd be killed. I mean, immediately. I don't think they've fully thought out the problem. I think they're ignoring that fact. But getting back to China, I do think that even if there's not like they didn't start it, they exploit it, and they continue to exploit it and push it and push it and push it. And I think that's the problem, as you mentioned, with TikTok, is it causes fragmentation of people and to dislike other people. It exaggerates anything that differentiates other people. And so it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've especially seen this over the years that people can agree on things, but if suddenly there's one thing they disagree on, it then like everything falls apart. It's like, okay, you must be the enemy, and so this is just another one of those issues where it's like, oh, we're all friends, and then wait, you support Israel or you support Palestine? Explosion, friendship over.
Right. I mean, if you look at the political parties in the United States, I mean, that's basically where we're at, right? I mean, Republicans and the Democrats have become fierce enemies, whereas before they used to be able to sit down after a session and knock things out over a drink, and then come back the next day and vote together and resolve America's problems. But today, it's become exaggerated in the political arena as well.
I thought it was interesting when they passed that foreign aid package for like Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, which also had the provision to like ban TikTok if it couldn't be sold to a U.S. company. That like the coverage of this in the media was like how weird it was that Mike Johnson, the GOP, he's the House majority leader right now, right? So he was working with Democrats to pass this legislation. And so like that is like the really weird anomalous situation that Democrats and Republicans could work together for something.
Though there have been polls, Pew Research Center, and I think some Gallup polls, that most Americans generally are pro-Israel, I think.
It's just that
there's a loud minority.
Well, I think there's more and more younger Americans that are less supportive of Israel than let's say the over 30 group. So the trend is the younger let's say the 18 to 22-year-olds are trending less supportive of Israel than they have in the past. That's the trend that people who support Israel are concerned about. That the youth are shifting.
I just remember Yomi Park, a North Korean activist, who had talked about how far left the Columbia had gone, and how it's like they teach you to hate America. And it's no wonder that university has exploded in these protests. That like these young people are being trained from a young age to be this kind of Marxist activist. It's very dangerous.
It's also important that, as long as they don't learn any history after like the 1930s, it's okay. Then they don't realize what happened with Marxism, and also, the genociding of Jews that, became like why the motivation for creating Israel, right? A homeland for the oppressed.
Kind of like the United States. I mean, United States became a homeland for people who came from war zones over the past 2 centuries.
Not true. It was genocide and oppression of indigenous people. America is founded in slavery.
Okay. I see you've been reading your Marxist books recently.
No, I've been reading the New York Times.
Same.
Well, so the last thing that I want to ask is, what can be done about China's support for Hamas and this war?
Global terrorism.
So I think, let's look at Russia, right? There have been calls to add Russia to the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism for its actions in Ukraine. And they're doing a lot of bad things in Ukraine. So just because China isn't directly doing things against Israel doesn't mean that they should be exempt from being examined as a potential country that supports terrorism, not only outside of China, but inside of China. I mean, they terrorize the Tibetans. They terrorize lots of different groups. Falun Gong. Everybody who's not a communist, pretty much, it could be counted as.
Uyghurs, the largest Muslim.
I mean, honestly, even Marxists in China get attacked and terrorized.
Right. So I think that's one thing is that it should be called out, and any information that can be found about their support should be highlighted and broadcast, and at a minimum, the public opinion of China should go down because of what they're doing. It's not news that they're oppressing people, so we should do something about it. So there's the International Criminal Court that decides whether people are conducting genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc., and aggression due to support of terrorist groups. There's a lot of mechanisms that can be used, and I don't know why we're hesitant to do that. I mean, we did call them out for genocide, but it only went so far. So it doesn't seem to me like we're doing too much to challenge their actions. We're letting them get away with it, and I don't know why that's happening.
Is it because we don't want to upset the apple cart? Maybe like, if the whole idea of engaging with China is that like we can bring them into the international order, going around being like, actually, they're sponsoring terrorism around the world would be a pretty big argument against that idea.
Well, maybe it's time to think about that, because they're not our friends. They only have one goal in mind, and that's power, and they want more of it. So they'll do whatever they can to make it happen. And they don't seem to have ethical guardrails that prevent them from getting too crazy about killing people. So I think that we need to really cautiously examine what they're doing around the world, and just like during the Soviet Union, we called out the Soviet Union for doing abuses in Eastern Europe against the Czechos. They invaded Czechoslovakia, and lots of civilians were killed. So I think that we need to really think about what is China and what are they doing, especially the Communist Party, and we need to be clear about what we accept and what we don't accept. And if they're tied to these riots in the United States, we need to call them out. We can't just let them, oh, this is just young people doing their thing. If we can find, and I think that it should be done, we should investigate what they're doing and how they're doing it and call them out.
And you think that should be done in the U.S. government level?
I think it should be done at every level. Individual, nonprofit, you guys, and if the government doesn't want to do it, then you shame them into doing it and you make them do it because it's the truth.
We'll call this clip China is a state sponsor of terrorism.
Yeah.
That'll shame the U.S. government for not doing it.
But it may not shame Wall Street, which still has hundreds of billions of dollars invested in China.
But if the U.S. government really said that China was a state sponsor of terrorism, then guess what? Wall Street can't invest in China because you can't invest in a country that sponsors terrorism. That's the law.
Right, but that's also why the U.S. government won't do it.
Well, don't worry. Once they see the title of this clip.
Yeah, you better be careful about this one because it's probably going to get demonetized on every channel that they can shut you down on.
Yes, please support us on Patreon. We rely on your support to keep making this show. Well, thank you very much for joining us again. This was very fascinating and very terrifying, which is most of our episodes.
Yep.
Well, I guess we all live in the same world. It's the kind of nightmare. Yeah.
We'll put a link to your article in the description below for anyone who wants to watch it. But yeah, this has been great to have you on.
Other people who watch articles.
What?
Nothing. You just said watch the article.
Yeah, keep an eye on this article.
Okay.
It's going places. What I couldn't help but think about during this is how, like a few years ago, Israel and China were getting pretty close. There was a lot of hey, they're investing, we're doing all these things. There was even a lot of security and dual use technology.
Yeah,
stuff
because
going on.
Israel has a lot of Taiwan has a lot of high tech industries, and the CCP was coming in. Chinese companies were investing in Israeli tech, buying Israeli tech, coming to Israel to set up companies. None of this would be a problem, right?
No. I mean, it's just like the same thing with the U.S. Hey, we're just getting along, doing business, everything's fine. Surely they aren't secretly plotting behind the scenes to completely massacre us.
I mean,
not necessarily like a metaphorical kind of massacre.
Uh-huh.
Well, I don't know.
But that may or may not include actually killing American troops and or civilians.
True. There you go.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
So we should still try to save it, to get close people-to-people communication with China. That's what the U.S. needs. Yeah, it's amazing, the idea that while they are doing, and that's why the CCP is so insidious with this, because they make these people-to-people connections, and you think you're talking to a friend. Everything's okay. Israel and China is getting closer. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're pulling all these strings, and when it becomes politically useful for them to potentially send out Hamas to massacre Israelis.
Yeah, or, at the very least, really exploit it for their own political advantage and tacitly support Hamas and not, support Israel in any way. Yep.
Yeah. And I know there will be some people who are now.
It's kind of like Ukraine, actually.
Yeah.
Because Ukraine was yes, we are selling our wheat to China. We're developing close ties or whatever. And then it's well, no, it's actually, no matter how much we talk about wanting to help you, find peace or whatever, it's like it's Russia.
Yeah.
We're supporting Russia.
Yeah, including giving dual-use, essentially military equipment.
How did those Chinese guns get to Russia?
Anything. But yeah, I know some people might respond to what G-Man said or his article with like a degree of skepticism. And it's good to have some skepticism. But it's also like you can't expect like perfect clarity, perfect proof when, a hostile authoritarian regime is taking advantage of the chaos of the Middle East. Like all you can see is sort of like these connections and be like, well, there's at least
I think it is
motivation.
Good to look further into this, essentially, which is what he was saying, right? Like, what we should be doing is, the U.S. government should be looking into whether, we have intelligence agencies. Maybe they could take a look at whether China is a state sponsor of terror.
That'd be good. And this has always been something I've wondered about. Like, if the problem of the Chinese Communist Party were to vanish, how many other problems in the world would also suddenly vanish?
Like, if the CCP no longer had enough power to...
Yeah, if it collapses, it's gone.
If it doesn't have the power to, like, meddle in all these places, you mean?
Yeah, like how many of the problems in the world ultimately behind the scenes tie back to the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, let's ask that question about the Soviet Union. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union for the next decade?
A lot of things got better.
They did.
Yeah. And we got into their archives and we found like all of the support they were giving to a lot of the civil rights movement groups in the 60s. And then it's like, oh, wow.
It was the anti-war movement primarily.
Yeah.
So, I think it's not going to be clear now, but it may be clear in the future after the CCP inevitably collapses. But, will that be in a year? Will it be in 50 years? I don't know.
When you were talking about the anti-war movement, I actually just thought about Code Pink, who is like a contemporary anti-war group, right? That was started by supposedly by American women who were like anti-Iraq war, like 20 years ago. Because that's how long ago the Iraq war was, 20 years ago. Anyway, but now they're essentially super supportive of the CCP.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, they disrupted some hearing that was on China.
Really?
Like, yes, it was at some point last year. Do you remember this? Because I remember like they were showing this Code Pink protester who was being like led out by a police officer, and I was like, that's Nuri Turkle sitting in the audience of this, of this like congressional hearing, yes, it was very much like, yes, Code Pink is now supporting the CCP because it is standing up against the U.S. empire.
Right. Anyone against the U.S. is the good guy.
Right, and this is what happens. Like there are often legitimate reasons to be opposed to a certain war, right? But what happens is the CCP will sometimes then take advantage of these groups and slowly push their own agendas within those, do a little bit of funding. Often it's quite indirect.
Oh my gosh.
And then,
So Code Pink, sorry. The same guy who supports the group that I was talking about, the People's Forum.
The Marxist billionaire?
Yes, he
With ties to the CCP.
He is allegedly also funding Code Pink.
How about that?
Yeah. Because I was just like, I remember reading about some China-related funding, so I was just Googling it.
Are we becoming that like conspiracy guy with like
like
the board?
All the board.
It's all connected.
Yeah, I do feel like that a lot when you're talking about the CCP. You do sound like the conspiracy guy with the board.
But this is what you're for. You ask questions about each of those connections.
Well, this is also why we're doing the show, because China is having a huge impact, and especially when we started. China Uncensored in 2012, just people were not talking. Well, not enough people were talking about it.
Yeah, the guy's name is Neville Roy Singham.
Neville
Roy Singham.
What a name. I want to steal his lunch money. All the $5 billion of his lunch money.
Yeah.
All right.
Here he is with... Oh, he married an activist, I think, who was run off with Code Pink. Yeah, it's very Yep.
What a world.
So then Code Pink had this whole the interrupting that hearing I was talking about. They had this. They were like yelling, "China's not the enemy,"
Interesting.
and things like that. So
Generally, would you describe the people in Code Pink as tall? Maybe not tall. Maybe they're little pinks.
Oh, I didn't know where you were going. I thought you were going to go towards the other thing that you tried to get me to say all the
Well, I
time.
mean,
and
if
was
they fall
trying-
into a little bit like some mud at a rally, then they'd be dirty reds. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll see you next time.